My feeling about robots is that they should look like robots. There's a fair amount of research out there that things that are beautiful make people calmer. They actually make you more productive. We make choices about what that future looks like. And we can choose things that are beautiful, fascinating, or we can choose to build things that are scary, alienating. That is the choice that we make now, today.
I love that. Catie, I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Astro.
We're going to have fun.
We are.
You know, you sort of presented while you were at X, at the Everyday Robots part of X, sometimes as a roboticist with a secret, passion for art, and sometimes as an artist with a secret passion for robotics. Unpack for me a little bit sort of how you think about yourself in general and maybe specifically for the time you spent at the Everyday Robot Project. Like, how did that feel?
My mission is to make nascent technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics more humanistic, whimsical, and widely accessible. How that materializes is sometimes through business, sometimes through research, and sometimes through art. But fundamentally, it's about creating an impact, wrapping your hands around the world, and shaking it a little bit. The medium through which that impact occurs, I think, can vary. When I first got into robotics, it's because my dad got really sick, and I saw him be in a hospital room surrounded by all these machines, and I thought there's something fundamentally wrong about the emotional experience that my dad is having in a caretaking context. And I thought, how can I take my emotional background, having spun up choreographies in the arts, and bring that into the application of machines that are supposed to take care of us? Okay, I've got to go study robotics. And I did my master's and my PhD in robotics, despite the fact that I didn't have an undergraduate degree in engineering. And so I think for me, it's a little less about I'm an artist, I'm a roboticist, and more what is the statement that I'm making, what's the impact that I want to create, and what are the tools that I need in order to get there.
Tell me a little bit about how you met us, how you ended up at X and with Everyday Robots.
It was totally random. I was a second-year PhD student at Stanford, and I opened an email listserv that I never open. It was one of these generic send out to all Stanford grad students, and it said that Google X was celebrating their new employee resource group, ERGs, in celebration of the Latinx community. And my dad's Cuban, and I thought, well, I've been a little curious about Google X. And then I came in, I didn't know a single person, and then ran into a woman I know from college, Olivia Hatalski, who was at X and has since, I think, started and run a project at X, and she introduced me to Dave Humans. I think at that point, Everyday Robots was still very stealth. Mm-hmm. They hadn't really said anything publicly. And Dave said, who are you? What do you do? And I said, well, I'm a choreographer and a roboticist, and we're all going to be screwed in the future if these robotics companies don't start hiring a bunch of choreographers. And I was standing there on my podium giving my little stump speech. I had no idea what Dave was working on. And then he said, oh, let's keep in touch. And then a couple weeks later, Dave and I were exchanging emails. He introduced me to Denise and Hans Peter, and then they said, we'd love to invite you to come be the artist in residence here. I felt that there was some alignment in the universe that allowed this opportunity to emerge, and I saw it as a potential to make some serious impact in what was still the preeminent machine learning robotics project that had ever been done.
Everyone at the Everyday Robots Project believed the criticality of not having the technologies that we were making be literally robotic. If we say they're robotic, what we mean by that is that they're giving off an affect that creeps us out really badly. We don't understand what's going on with them. Like, we want our robots to not be robotic in that sense. Mm-hmm. But then you brought dance into this. How did you help Everyday Robots understand the connection between dance as a medium and a way of trying to work with our robots and with the team itself, and how that addresses this issue of not having our robots be robotic?
We're going to see billions of robots in our lifetimes. I fundamentally believe that.
I agree.
It only took 13 years for 1 billion iPhones to start being used on Earth. We think about what are the technologies that are most likely to show up in the next 50 years. For me, I strongly believe it's robots. When you think about billions of robots on Earth, that is billions of people who are using those robots. Those people are broad and varied in terms of what their experience is with technologies and their backgrounds. They're going to be all different ages, all different education levels, all different genders and sexual orientations. They're going to live in all different kinds of spaces. When you think about the kinds of technologies that have been able to reach that diverse of a population, it's because they invited all of these new subdomains into the creation of that technology. When you took a computer out of a giant research or military facility and you stuck it on everyone's lap, that meant that you needed psychologists, linguists, semiotics people in order to represent iconography. All of a sudden, you had this whole domain of industrial design that exploded, sound design. And it was because you were creating something that billions of people could use. That was not a niche for tens of thousands of people. The main difference between a robot and a computer is that a robot moves. The people who are experts at creating compelling, emotionally affective, contextually relevant motion are choreographers. And we're trained in how to do that in a multiplicity of ways. When you have lots of agents that are moving around each other, when those agents are heterogeneous, when those agents don't have perfect directed outcomes of how they're meant to behave, and you want to have uncertainty in a state machine type format, these are the things that choreographers learn and are trained how to do. When I think about robot choreography, what I do and a few other people do right now is fairly novel, but there will be tens of thousands of people who do what I do in the future, just the same way that you have tens of thousands of people who are graphic designers or industrial designers or product designers. I mean, when you think about opening the door of a car, pulling a handle, that's a choreographic motion. That's a different motion than if I were to pull my hand up and down. We've already instilled choreography into these different kinds of objects. But when we do it in robotics, we're doing it at a whole other level because they move autonomously. Everything, for the most part, that moves autonomously is a part of nature. Squirrels, trees in the wind, and we have developed over hundreds of thousands of years an evolutionary prior to comprehend what that motion means, whether or not it's threatening. Now, all of a sudden, we have things that are moving autonomously, like Waymos, like robots, that are not a part of nature. And our brains have not adapted over hundreds of thousands of years of observing and experiencing that motion to understand what it means. And when you think about having a robot inside of a place where people are especially very vulnerable, whether that's a nursing home or preschool, safety is not just important, it's the perception of safety. It's the perception of care, of closeness. And we have this small window to land that plane, and I think choreography will be the unique unlock that will get us there.
This kind of body language could play out either badly or well, depending on relatively small changes. So we're imagining a robot and it's coming over. I don't know, it's going to open a door, it's going to pick up a cup, it's going to try to hand you something. Give us an example of, like, in the specifics, how would it be done so that it feels threatening or confusing? What would be the bad version and what's the good version of that?
Give you a really simple example. You're walking down a hallway and there's a robot that's walking towards you. There are some versions of today's robots, I won't say who, that will get very close to you, because that's how long it'll take for the robot to detect where you are, very close to you, stop, and then somehow orient around you. That's not what humans do when we pass each other, right? We see someone at a specific distance, the two of you anticipate that you're going to be changing lanes effectively, and you adjust your bearing before you arrive right in front of that human being. And it's so subtle, but these kinds of proximate things, they either freak you out and make you think this robot's gonna run into me, or they create just enough uncertainty that you don't know what the robot's thinking. How strange would it be if you were crossing a hallway next to a person, they walked all the way straight up to you, right in front of Astro, and you were like, what's going on here? Are they going left? Are they going right? So there's something like that about being able to change orientation in space that's very subtle. The second one that I always describe to people is there's a cup on the table right now. I'm sitting down in a chair, but I'm not overtly looking at the cup. And while I'm making nice eye contact with Astro, I just reach my arm out and grab this cup and come back. That's super creepy. Nobody locks and holds eye contact and somehow in some strange space pulls their arm out to the side.
Even though you can, you just did it.
Even though you could, right. You just did. But it creates a creep factor. It, again, has some uncertainty. There's a lack of predictability. And it's that simple versus if I was sitting here as a robot, I know that I want to pick up my glass of water. I direct my gaze over to it so you can anticipate what I'm going to do, and I reach out and grab it with my hand. And I think those kinds of subtleties, we can see them mirrored across all different kinds of technologies. And those are the kinds of choices we need to make with robots.
Can you maybe talk a tiny bit about eye contact and the nod as like another one of these things for sending kind of social cues when one of the two participants is not a human?
I think eye contact's an interesting one, and psychologists and neuroscientists have even studied the frequency at which you blink and how much you're supposed to look away. That if you're glued in nonstop on the eye contact, it can feel a little creepy for some people. I think with robots, adapting a couple of these social cues that we know to have specific connotations, probably in the short term is a good thing. In the longer term, robots might develop some of their own social cues and connotations that we can associate with a robot that's different than with a human. Maybe with robots, they'll develop a certain kind of little shake motion or something when they've messed up.
Like when we hang our head when we're sorry.
Exactly, right. We're going to have robots that make mistakes, and they need to develop a vocabulary around communicating to the human, we're still safe, even though I've just made a mistake.
Can you talk about music mode a little bit? That was one of my favorite things that happened with Everyday Robots.
Music mode is what we call a software where we transform all of the motion from the robots into sound so that the robots play music while they move.
And this wasn't like rock music or something.
No.
Describe what the music is so people can imagine it.
We actually tried a bunch of different soundscapes to see what would work in the sense that it would create a sense of calm and inspiration, and we played around with a bunch of different soundscapes. We played around with heightening the robot's existing sounds, and then we settled on these beautiful analog instruments. We had a cello sound, we had these beautiful, bass notes, kind of fluttering trumpet sounds, and we had each joint of the robot be mapped to a different sound, and the relative proportion of that joint also was associated with the correct sound. So the gripper is very small. When it opens and closes, you hear this beautiful bell chiming, versus the torso that's a little bit larger, and you got to hear a deeper, more robust cello noise. The experience that people had with the software completely blew my mind. I thought it would be evocative to see a robot drive around a building.
And it was.
Yeah, sorting trash while creating its own music soundtrack. And I would get these emails from engineers who were like, I'm crying at my desk because I've never seen a piece of technology be so beautiful and make me feel so affected. And when we had music mode and we put it on all of the robots, we could turn it on at any time. So you would have a robot that was either navigating down a hallway or wiping a table or sorting trash, and you would hear the symphony of what that motion was manifesting.
Though I didn't know exactly what you had mapped to what, I felt like I had gotten to the place where I could close my eyes and almost envision its physicality just by listening to it. I could certainly tell how much it was moving and maybe what parts of it were moving. So it felt like, even when it was out of my peripheral vision, that I kind of could still see it. The other experience I had was I caught myself a few times being sad and a little bit jealous that I couldn't make music when I moved.
Yeah.
I felt like it was one of the things where like they somehow had gotten a better deal than us because it just seemed so wonderful. It felt almost more human.
We had a couple different music modes too. I think everyone really loved the software and it was pretty flexible. And so we did one that was different strings and a guitar chord. So it was like, kind of swirling sounds like that. And then somebody made a club, house music version of music mode. And so it was like, when all the different joints were moving. And we wound up running a research study on that project and found that people perceived the robots to be more animate, anthropomorphic, likable, intelligent, and safe if it was playing music mode. They also found it meaningful that it was indeed mapped to something real as opposed to here's random music playing, because they saw the robots as more capable when it was doing the mapping than when it was just random sound. It certainly taught us a lot about how people experience sound cues and how they feel some sense of what the robot's capability and purpose is based on the sounds that it makes.
I saw music mode before it was ever explained to me, and I immediately got, that like that one part of the sound only happens when it's driving forward. When the wheels stop moving, it's stationary. Even if it's moving its arm, then that, at least that part of the sound goes away. So you very quickly start to turn the sound into a kind of body language.
Exactly right. Yes. And we need those kinds of cues because you probably won't have a robot in the future narrate every single thing it does. It's not going to say, now my front wheels are driving,
Or its intentions, or its needs.
Right. It might not say all of those things explicitly through language. So how can it develop some kind of social cue proxy that is not pure English, but also potentially not pure human body language, the same way that we can point to other technologies and say that they've drawn out their own lexicon simply by existing.
Can you talk a little bit about the flocking that you had them do?
Once we could teach robots how to play music, we needed to get them to move around. And I started with a few different ideas, all of which were bad, which is fine. Like, that's what happens. Mostly around kind of getting one human and one robot to do different interactive dances together and have the robot learn how to dance from the human. And that's part of what makes our robots so unique, is that they are learning robots. They are not going to be perfectly controlled, scripted, programmed the same way that many other robots we have and many other robot dancing videos we've seen. So with that provocation, we started to think about what would it be like if you could teach robots how to flock together in groups like animals and do it in a way that they can be in situ with people. So you get this experience of, I'm in the future where there's all these robots around, and yet somehow I feel safe and my motion is legible to them and I can control them with very little training. It was super hard. To my knowledge, no one had ever done a multi-robot project with those robots. And so it took us a long time to be able to put a bunch of robots in simulation. And we started with this reinforcement learning approach, which was to try to get them to make evocative, interesting flocking patterns using reinforcement learning, and literally worked on that, I think, for 6 months before we were able to run it on a real robot. Looked fine in simulation, looked terrible in the real world. And so we went back to the drawing board and thought about how to change direction. And Benji Holson, who was the head of the applications team, had this suggestion. He goes, why don't you start with this pretty canonical flocking algorithm called Boyd's algorithm, and then see if you can make a bunch of modifications on that. And then we wound up learning, using simple imitation learning problem structure, all of the different weights of these different aspects of the flock, which created these interesting patterns. Then we also learned the preferences of a choreographer. So me as a choreographer, I would say, let's flock in this way, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one, because I was intuiting what would look the most interesting. And ultimately, that was the approach that we went with. I think so many impressive things that have to do with robotics and technology is about highlighting what the machine is capable of.
I agree. You actually said that part of the goal was to have the humans be able to control the flock. I'm not sure if this was intended or not, but I didn't feel like I was controlling them. I felt much more like I was being included.
Wow. Say more
now,
about that.
Maybe it was because I was on wheels.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how many people you had on wheels with the robots. I mean, yes, I could tell that they were responding to me, but I also felt like I was responding to them, that I was moving around, and my choices of where to go, where to stop, were also being affected by where they were and where they were moving. I don't know, I just felt included in the flock more than I felt like I was controlling the flock.
Did it raise any questions for you about what your future life would look like?
Not really, but I might be the wrong person to ask. I live in the future. One of the things I most liked seeing, in a way it felt the most like seeing the future, was the kids. So talk a little bit about the kids and how they were with the robots. Because for me, watching 5-year-olds with these robots was wildly more interesting than my own experiences with the robots or watching any other grown-up with the robot.
We had a few days towards the end of the project where we invited anyone who wanted to bring their partners, parents, kids to come and experience the project. And I'm so grateful that we had the time to do that. I mean, especially to you and HB, because it allowed us to play and share this project with a group of people that had never seen it before. I saw kids doing and being engaged and asking questions about these robots in ways that I never could have expected. They were running up and wanting to ride on them and doing these gestures and asking about the music and pointing to them and telling them where to go here, robot, go here, come closer to me. And I got the sensation that it was a natural, intuitive thing for them, as opposed to I need to be taught what I'm doing. And that they also felt invited, that it was playtime. You could come and play instead of have your behavior, policed or something. And is an extraordinary testament to the team and all of the engineers to build a robot that could be that safe, to be around a bunch of 5-year-olds who were no pinch points, no collisions, and if anything, stretched the technical capabilities of the robot to not only create that project, but to put it in situ with a bunch of people who were not going to be dainty around the robot.
What was your experience when you spent time with them?
I felt myself flying a little. I felt that I had projected some version of myself into this machine. I think the thing that makes us unique as a species is our relationship to our tools. We don't do very well in cold weather or hot weather. We have no fur or hair. We're not particularly strong. We're not very fast. The thing that makes us unique is that we have these big, glorious brains, and it allows us to manipulate our environment to make technology. I might even argue that society is a technology. Money is a technology. It's these stories that we tell that have meaning to us. And the first time I ever danced with a robot, I felt myself all of a sudden on this long continuum of my species, my ancestors, and our tools. Thousands of years ago, somebody sitting down in front of a fire and feeling the majesty of that moment, the warmth to the wheel and the printing press and the first computer and the internet. And I just felt myself along this long continuum of being in relationship to a machine in a way that allowed me to expand my experience of the everyday, to step outside of my body and be involved in something new. And it was so stimulating, like mentally and physically, that I thought I want to do this for the rest of my life. And I think that it is a representation of a series of questions that we will have to answer because of all of these robots showing up in our world in new ways. The sensation, that's the experience I look to create in so many parts of my work. That feeling of I am in relationship to magic, yet it's responding to me, I'm responding to it. We are in conversation. I feel agency, I feel empowered, and I feel a gaze to that little light at the end of the tunnel about how my humanity might shift moving forward. Starts with a simple dance, goes somewhere very far.
I love that. Can you tell me a little bit about the Impact Lab?
Impact Lab was led by an amazing woman named Denise Gamboa, and she and HP had this idea, which was we want to do something that's never been done before, which is to build high-quality robots powered by machine learning that can do multiple tasks in everyday environments. Okay, we're trying to get to this, as you know, big moonshot. In order for us to get there, we have to do things we've never done before, and that means that we need to involve all of these experts outside of the classical robotics and engineering field to not only describe some of the potential pitfalls or ethical questions that were coming up, but to push us out of our own predictable way of thinking. There were so many extraordinary and experienced roboticists on the team, some people who'd been doing robotics for like 25, 30, 40 years. It always behooves you, I think, to shake yourself outside of your existing patterns and ways of being, which I think Impact Lab very much did. So there was a philosopher in residence, an anthropologist, working with labor leader Andy Stern to describe, we're going to be building robots that there will be millions of them in the future doing all different kinds of tasks. What does that mean for the future of human employment? And bringing those people in and having them dialogue gave the team a sense of what we're working on is greater and grander, and we need to be thinking about all of these parts of the shadows or potential concerns that could be raised in shifting the way that you live people's lives. So Denise ran Impact Lab, and we had a speaker series. There were different people that would come in, and an architect like Thomas Heatherwick and Alison Gopnik, who's a psychology professor at UC Berkeley, has done a bunch of work with DARPA to think about how do you teach an AI to learn like a kid, because kids are really good at generalization with very little data, and they also are very resilient when they fall over. And so how can we learn from people like her as we try to build learning robots? Ultimately, that was part of the magic of being in a place like X, was being able to participate in and do something like Impact Lab because you're thinking on that scale.
A few of you on the team, particularly you and Hans Peter, had some strong feelings about not having them look like robots often look like. Talk a little bit about just the visual appearance, even when it's not moving. Like, what did this robot look like, and where were we headed in terms of the look and feel of the robot? What was the thinking behind that?
This robot is, I would say, about a head shorter than me, so I think a little under 5 feet. It had one arm with a 2-finger gripper on it. The majority of the robot was white with some gray shading and a couple of yellow fingers. So it was on wheels, no legs, and it had this pan-tilt head with a number of cameras in it and an LED ring around it, and then this columnal body, so you could tuck the arm 100% behind. And as a robot, it was fairly compact. We have this fascination with our own species, and that means that lots of people are making humanoid robots that have 2 arms, maybe 2 legs, 2, quote, eyes, cameras. So it's bilaterally symmetric. The robot is the same on the right and the left. And my fellow roboticists, many of them insist on building robots that look like people. I think some of that is because of this technology fascination of what you've seen in fiction and media, and maybe because you've seen things like Big Hero 6, maybe because you've seen things like Terminator, and you feel inspired by these stories and you want to build them. My perspective, and some very senior roboticists, big robotics leaders like Rodney Brooks, will say that you are setting yourself up to have to contend with the very, very, very high expectations that you've now placed on your shoulders. Because the closer that something looks to a human, the higher the expectation people have for how performant that robot can be. And the less willing they are to tolerate some of those robots' mistakes, and certainly some of its limitations. I think that balance of how humanoid to make something or not is one criteria. There's another criteria about how do you make something that looks like tech, a real piece of technology, versus this is an object that happens to have technology in it. I think that's potentially another spectrum. Whereas there are some robot arms that are soft. They're made out of these very pliant materials. And so it looks a little more like an object that's somehow been mechanized, but it doesn't give you that feel of, oh, this is hardcore technology. And then, of course, the uncanny valley, again, is looking at this human-like, non-human-like, where if you go too far and you make it too human-like, you can really creep people out. And if you don't go far enough, then people aren't exactly sure how to relate to it. And so there's so many factors like this at play when it comes to human-robot interaction. My feeling about robots is that they should look like robots, but that there's a fair amount of research out there, and from my own felt experience, that things that are beautiful make people calmer. They actually make you more productive. So I think being around a robot that's beautiful and ethereal could be potentially beneficial for your health. But even more than that, my feeling is that we get to build the future that we want. We make choices about what that future looks like. And we can choose things that are beautiful, fascinating, artistically informed, or we can choose to build things that are scary, alienating, predictable, annoying, boring, fatiguing. And if we don't make conscientious decisions about those things, we don't get to complain. We don't get to sit there in the future and be like, oh, I wish I wasn't surrounded by all these ugly, scary robots. It's like, yeah, because that is the choice that we make now, today. We set the standard. We create a prior for what people can expect.
You were mentioning Terminator. We have all of these different robots in our popular media, and some of them, like WALL-E or BB-8 or R2-D2, they're rounded, they're cute, they're much shorter than us. We have a lot of affection for them. Some of them, clearly, like the Terminator, are made in the popular media to create fear for us. And arguably both have stuck in our popular consciousness. But there is a lot of fear about how robots might replace us, or it's unnatural, it's a particularly visceral sense that the world is changing, so it might not even be just about the robots. What are your thoughts, past just the body language of the robots, about how much fear people have and how we can help them with that?
Fear is real for many people, and the saturation of robots in society right now is not that high, which means that likely your exposure to a robot has been through fiction or media. There are not lots of people who get to walk around the hallways of X and see robots do things, or even work in a hospital where you have a robot that's delivering medication from one nursing station to the next. Really, the exposure that people have to robots right now is not that high, which means that you're filling in so many blanks with what you've been exposed to from fiction and media, which is where I always tell my fellow artists how powerful you are in terms of being able to pivot the public's imagination in one direction or the next. We latch onto stories so strongly. They deeply inform the way that we think and feel about robots. I think right now, those stories, as you mentioned, Terminator, some of them are very adversarial, and certainly it has this undercurrent of xenophobia. That's other. I don't understand that. Let me push that away. It's scary. As a roboticist, robots today have a long ways to go until they're as ubiquitous as some of what I've described in this future scenario. And we, as roboticists and as the general public, have quite a bit of agency and autonomy in terms of describing what we do and don't want. And the choices that we make are going to determine whether these robots that we build in the future are scary and undesirable, or things that we do indeed embrace and want to be around. So I would say, do not allow the fear to remove you from your own agency. I think the second one, in terms of robots coming for our jobs, automation is a fact of human work life. I think it's a statistic from the Wall Street Journal, is like 57% of the jobs that exist today didn't exist in the 1960s. We are always in a cyclical pattern of moving into new kinds of work. We didn't have software engineers in the 1930s. Now we have millions of them. There are always new domains and forms of expertise that are showing up. For example, at Everyday Robots, we had robot veterinarians. It's hard to be a robot veterinarian if you don't have a robot. It's hard to be a mechanic if you've never invented a car. So these new technologies also enable new kinds of work. It's the narrative, not the actual number of jobs that are changing, but it's the story that we tell that is so scary for people about that. Then the third thing, in terms of the fear component, is that it requires a diversity of people who come from many different backgrounds and have different forms of expertise. Whether you're interested in fashion or sound and light design, there is a place for you in this new universe. And so I think some of dispelling that fear is also to open the door and say that this is an invitation for many different kinds of people to lend and contribute their voices. The first reaction that they have is emotional. It has nothing to do with, well, is this faster? Is it cheaper? Like, it's just a felt sense. And I think the fear that so many people have is proof that we need to address these kinds of emotional hurdles.
You said at the beginning of this conversation that you thought that no robotics company had ever sort of shot as high or as far as Everyday Robot was shooting, and maybe none has made more progress. Can you unpack a little bit both the aspiration and kind of what you think Everyday Robot's legacy might be?
It's only now that I'm not at Everyday Robots that I even realize how crazy some of the stuff is that we were doing. Like, I remember one day on an app day, we had this idea of like, let's hand a water bottle back and forth between me and a robot. And I worked on it with Kim Clavin, and then we showed it to Benji Holson and Daniel Lamb and a couple of other people who were on the team. It took, an hour, 2 hours for us to train the robot on what a water bottle looks like. And now let's train the robot on what I look like, and then teach it to, grasp at the right speed and that it can adjust when I wiggle my arm around and try to fool the robot and move the water bottle to different places. And then a couple years after that, some big paper came out that was like, robots can take objects from humans. I think it was the concatenation of all that excellence on those different levels that allowed those kinds of tasks to feel trivial when in reality they really were not. And I can think of that for a few different instances, with Everyday Robots, even being able to coordinate and hook up a bunch of them to talk to each other and not have massive amounts of latency in this flocking project, and to do that amount of human detection. At one point, I think we had 50 people inside of the space, and the robots weren't crashing. You know, like there were all kinds of things like that, which I think it was because there was so much excellence and experience in these different categories of like mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and that there had been this foresight around doubling down on AI and machine learning. And the external robotics community was very much had a consensus that doing artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics was a dead end. And I would say that that belief proliferated probably through the end of 2022 when there was a significant paper that landed called SayCan from the folks at Robotics at Google, then DeepMind, which was done on, you know, the Everyday Robots in collaboration with a bunch of Everyday Robots engineers. And people saw for the first time, oh, hooking an LLM up into a robot in order to teach it to do different kinds of tasks is tremendously valuable. And now you cannot be a robotics company today without having an AI story. And we laid so much groundwork when it came to navigation in different crowded spaces, being in situ. We got to do that in Google buildings 4 or 5 years ago. And so even that operational experience of how do you put a robot in a brand new environment and get it up and running, all of that knowledge, it was so novel at the time. And I think it's only with a little bit of perspective and distance that I've even understood how far we were going.
You were here for a number of years. You spent time almost exclusively on Everyday Robots, but you certainly talked to a lot of other people at X. Pretend I was starting my first day at X today, and I could really use some pointers on how to take moonshots. What are some of your learned lessons? I
think X is responsible for reframing my understanding of failure. I've since then taken on many more, I would say, large projects that had a high likelihood of failure, and yet being able to say you didn't fail, you learned something, or it allowed you to take the next step in a different direction certainly came from being a part of X. People here are creative in the classical definition of that word. They literally manifest things out of nothing. They take an idea and they implement it inside of the real world. They are a creator. In addition to being creative, which is that they have sets of ideas or imaginings or exchanges or a practice that's somewhat novel, that's in service of what hasn't been done before. I think normalizing that on some level is unique. One of my favorite statistics is how many humans have ever lived and died in the history of our species. It's not that many. It's 100 billion people. You're 1 in 100 billion. Let's say I want 10 billion people in the future to use something that I've worked on as a moonshot. 9% of all humans ever who've ever lived have used something that you've worked. Like saying that kind of stuff at X, not weird. Like totally fine. So I would say those are maybe the 3 things. The first one around failure, the second one of creativity, creator, and the third one being able to think and work on a different scale.
Paint a picture for how you see the future a little bit. Is it just going to be like the billion robots over on one side, the billion humans on another? Are we going to be mixed like 50-50? Paint me a picture of the future that you're hopeful for.
Demographics are changing. We're seeing some shifts in the distribution of how populations are, especially in a lot of Western countries like Europe and the United States. People certainly aren't having as many kids as they used to. And that creates a couple of interesting macroeconomic changes. The first one is that we're going to have a fairly large elderly population without as many young people to take care of them. And it's subtle because it doesn't necessarily mean a robot that replaces a caretaker. My dad, for example, is 75 years old. He lives in a modest house. It's 1 story. And I would love for my dad to live independently as long as possible. Doesn't necessarily mean that he needs a Rosie the Robot caretaker doing every single thing inside of his house, but he needs a couple of augmentations that a robot can help provide, which are making sure that he's hydrated enough, letting him know if the stove is still on, or if he drops something that he's having a hard time picking up, helping him pick up that object and put it at a higher level. Andrew Ng has this beautiful assertion. He says, robots won't replace jobs, they'll replace tasks. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, a robot could help participate in that. And a caretaker might still come 1 day a week, but maybe they won't come 5 days a week, and robots will fill in some of that gap shortage. I think that's a big one.
You just added something to my kind of vision of the future. I hadn't really focused in on the ways that they might actually purposefully underperform to give someone like your dad the dignity of doing the things that he can do, even if the robot could do them. It would be part of their job to not do them. And then I had this image of the robot actually being a little bit like a therapist and a coach, and be like, I could pick that up, but you can pick it up. Encouraging your dad because the robot knows that that's going to keep your dad strong in the longer term.
There was a wonderful paper I used to cite all the time from a professor at Cornell Tech named Shiri Azenkut, where she found that people who were blind or low vision, when they were navigating around shopping malls that they'd never been to before, they could have a human who was assisting them, that was walking them into different stores or making sure they didn't collide in anyone in the hallway. Or they could have a robot. And so they had people in both of these conditions, and a robot was teleoperated. So someone was driving the robot behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the low vision or blind person. And what they found is that the people who were blind or low vision preferred having the robot because it made them feel more agential, that they had more autonomy and they were more capable. And so I think there may be a number of instances like that in the future where being able to say, I learned it, quote, by myself with the assistance of a machine might be empowering for people instead of disempowering. I think a second opportunity is that you'll have some spaces that are right now dirty, dull, and dangerous. Oil rigs that need to be cleaned by scuba divers, it's incredibly dangerous, or really large shipping vessels. These are all things that would be fantastic for robots to do because they put humans in scary conditions. So I think those two things are quite practical in the near to medium term future when we think about moving that much farther out. And I think there are a couple of big challenges that our species are undergoing, like how are we going to have a food supply, keeping the oceans clean, reducing the amount of greenhouse gas that shows up in the atmosphere. I think there are robots that could create many different interventions for some of those big problems. It's almost like there are some problems that are so big that we can't say what the solution is going to be in the present, but we can continue to build robots and machines that are more and more capable. And I think we'll reach a certain point of maturity in the future where maybe robots become so good at being autonomous in the ocean, and ocean acidification has reached such a climax that it's like the technology that meets the moment. So I'm hyper optimistic about our future with robots.
Catie, thank you so much for doing this with me.
Of course. Thank you, Astro.